The Hells Angels biker heard the little girl cry from an oil pit, and what he did next terrified every man in earshot. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The wind howled through the abandoned industrial park as Jake Morrison, a grizzled Hells Angels biker, cruised down the empty road on his Harley-Davidson. His mind was restless, as usual, drowning out the noise of the outside world with the roar of his engine. But suddenly, something pierced through the usual hum of the bike. A sound, a cry, a scream, a child's cry, weak and desperate, drifting from somewhere ahead. Jake's eyes darted around, scanning the area. His fingers tightened on the handlebars as his instincts kicked in. He slowed down, glancing around the dark, desolate space. The oil pit. The cry came again, louder now, and Jake's heart raced as he realized the source. Without thinking, he turned sharply, his bike kicking up gravel as he sped toward the sound. His eyes narrowed, scanning the area for any sign of life. The pit was massive, filled with dark, thick oil that had been left abandoned for years. It looked like a graveyard for machines, rusted cars scattered around, surrounded by debris. But there, near the edge of the pit, was a small, trembling figure. A little girl, no older than 7, crying and struggling to keep herself afloat in the viscous black oil. Her clothes were torn, her skin smeared with dirt and oil, and she was gasping for air, her tiny arms flailing helplessly. Without a second thought, Jake jumped off his bike, his boots landing heavily on the ground as he rushed toward the girl. She looked up, fear written all over her face. Her wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, Jake hesitated. His reputation, his life, everything he had been taught told him to keep moving, to avoid involvement with anyone who wasn't part of his world. But something in those eyes stopped him cold. She was just a child, lost and scared, and the man he had become couldn't ignore that. He reached out, his calloused hand gently but firmly pulling her from the pit. She gasped, shuddering in his grip, and instinctively recoiled from him, as if she had never seen kindness in a man like him. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you," Jake murmured, his voice softer than he ever thought possible. The girl trembled, still unsure, but as Jake carefully wrapped his leather jacket around her tiny body, she stopped struggling. She didn't trust him, but she didn't fight him either. "What's your name, kid?" Jake asked, kneeling down to her level, trying to make her feel safe. The girl looked at him, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Emma." He gently wiped the oil from her face, his mind racing with questions. What was she doing here? Where were her parents? Jake could feel the weight of his past crashing into him, the mistakes, the choices he had made that led him down this path. He had spent so much of his life building walls around his heart, and now, standing in front of this child, those walls began to crack. He hadn't saved anyone in a long time, maybe never, but Emma needed him. For the first time in years, Jake felt like he was needed for something good. "I'm gonna get you out of here, Emma. You're safe now," Jake promised, though he wasn't sure if he believed the words himself. As he lifted her into his arms, the sound of his motorcycle engine rumbling seemed almost like a promise, like he was taking her away from the danger and bringing her to a place where she would be safe. But Jake didn't know what awaited him or what was waiting for them down the road. All he knew was that the ride ahead would change everything, and for once, he was willing to face whatever came next. Jake carefully adjusted Emma in his arms, her small frame shivering from the cold as he carried her towards his Harley. The sound of her soft sobs echoed in the quiet, abandoned industrial park, and for the first time in years, Jake felt something stir inside him, a sense of responsibility he hadn't experienced in a long time. He gently placed her in the front seat of his bike, securing her carefully with his jacket, making sure she was warm and protected. She looked up at him, eyes wide with fear and confusion. He knew she didn't trust him yet. Hell, he didn't trust himself, but he couldn't leave her there. The wind howled as Jake revved the engine, the low growl of the bike breaking the stillness of the night. He glanced back at Emma, still looking lost, her small hands gripping the edges of his jacket. "We're gonna get through this," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. The ride felt longer than it should have. The cold was biting, and every mile seemed to stretch on forever as the landscape blurred around them. Jake's mind raced, thoughts tumbling over each other, but one thing remained constant. He couldn't ignore the fact that this child needed him. He didn't know where her parents were or why she was alone, but he couldn't let her go back to whatever nightmare she had come from. They finally reached Jake's garage, a rundown place on the outskirts of town that smelled of oil and old memories. It wasn't much, but it was his. He pulled up to the door and cut the engine, the sound of the bike dying away into the still night. He helped Emma off the bike, her legs unsteady beneath her. She winced slightly as she stood, the oil still slick in her hair, and looked up at him, confusion clouding her face. "This is where I live," Jake said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. He opened the door to the garage, revealing the space he'd made into his home. It wasn't much, just a few old tools, a workbench, and an old couch, but it was clean. He led her inside and helped her sit down on the couch, pulling the blankets from the nearby cabinet to wrap her up. "I'm going to get you cleaned up and warmed up. Just hold on a second," Jake said as he moved to grab a first aid kit. He worked quickly, wiping away the grime from her face, trying to make her feel at ease. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice how small and fragile she looked, how her eyes held a sadness that went far beyond her age. "What happened to you, Emma?" Jake asked softly, his voice a mixture of concern and curiosity. She didn't answer right away, just stared at her hands. After a long pause, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "My mama, she's gone. And my daddy, he left me." Her words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. His heart twisted, memories of his own past flooding back. He didn't know how to help her. He wasn't a good man, hadn't been for a long time. He was part of the Hells Angels, a club built on strength and loyalty, but that loyalty was to his brothers, not to strangers. And now here he was, in his garage, taking care of a little girl who had no one. "I'm sorry, Emma," Jake said quietly, his voice rough. "I know it's not much, but you're safe here. You're not alone anymore." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. "You promise?" she asked. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I promise." Jake felt the weight of her gaze, the trust she was slowly placing in him. He had no idea how he was going to fix this situation or what he could do for her, but one thing was clear, he wasn't leaving her. The storm outside raged on, but inside the garage, the warmth of the fire and the silence between them felt like a new beginning. For the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel like a man running away from his past. He felt like someone who was needed, and that was something he wasn't going to take for granted. As the hours passed, Emma fell asleep on the couch, the exhaustion of the day finally taking its toll. Jake sat across from her, watching her sleep, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going anywhere, and neither was she. The world outside was dark and full of dangers, but for once, in that moment, the garage felt like a safe place. Jake leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to the future, and to a promise he didn't know how he was going to keep. But he would try. He would do whatever it took to keep her safe. That was the least he could do. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of Jake's garage, casting long shadows across the floor. The fire had long since died down, leaving only the faint smell of smoke and the warmth of the small space that had become a haven for both him and Emma. She was still asleep on the couch, her small body wrapped in an old blanket he had found in the back of the garage. Jake sat in his worn chair, watching her as she slept, her face peaceful for the first time since he had found her. He didn't know what had happened to her or why she had been alone, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her now. He had failed so many people in his life. Family, friends, even his own brothers. But this little girl, Emma, she had already started to change him in ways he didn't quite understand yet. The world outside was cold and indifferent, but here, inside these four walls, he could at least try to do something right. He had promised her she was safe, and that promise meant more to him than he wanted to admit. As the minutes ticked by, Jake tried to shake off the memories of his past, the life he had left behind when he walked away from the Hells Angels. It hadn't been an easy decision, and he had lost a lot in the process. But none of that mattered now. He had to focus on Emma, on keeping her safe, on making sure she felt like she wasn't alone anymore. The silence was broken by a soft rustling sound, and Jake turned to see Emma waking up. Her small eyes blinked in the dim light, still groggy from sleep. She looked around, clearly unsure of where she was, but when her gaze landed on Jake, she relaxed slightly, remembering where she was. "Good morning," Jake said quietly, trying to sound comforting. Emma gave him a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She was still scared, still lost in a world she didn't understand. "Morning," she whispered back, her voice small and uncertain. Jake stood up and walked over to the small fridge in the corner of the garage, pulling out some milk and cereal. He set it down on the small table in the center of the room, trying to make things feel normal, even if just for a little while. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Emma nodded, her eyes fixed on the food, but she didn't move. She seemed to be waiting for something. Jake hesitated, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. He had never been good with kids, never had the patience for it. But Emma was different. She had a quiet strength, a wisdom that seemed to surpass her years. He knew she had been through more than any child should have to endure, and it weighed on him. "It's okay," he said gently. "We'll get through this together." Emma finally climbed off the couch, her legs shaky as she walked over to the table. She sat down slowly, her eyes never leaving Jake as if trying to figure out whether she could trust him. He sat across from her, not sure what else to say. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft clinking of the spoon against the bowl as Emma ate her breakfast. Jake watched her, feeling a mix of guilt and responsibility. He had been in situations before where he had to protect someone, but this felt different. He wasn't just protecting her from the world. He was protecting her from himself. The Hells Angels had taught him that loyalty meant everything. But the loyalty he had once felt for the club had long since faded. Now, all that mattered was keeping Emma safe. He couldn't protect her from everything. He wasn't that powerful, but he could give her a chance. And that's what he intended to do. Emma finished her breakfast and sat back, her eyes fixed on the window. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake took a deep breath, unsure of how to answer. "Now we take it one step at a time," he said, his voice steady. "We figure out what's next, but for now, you're safe here." Emma looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening. For the first time since he had found her, she looked like she believed him. Jake stood up and stretched, glancing outside through the grimy windows. The world beyond was still dark and cold, but he knew they had to face it eventually. "I'll take care of you, Emma," he said firmly. "I don't know how we're going to do it, but we'll make it through." Emma nodded, her small hand reaching out to grip his sleeve. She didn't say anything, but the trust in her eyes was enough. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it. Together, they had both been broken by the world in different ways, but maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal. The door to the garage creaked as the wind howled outside, but inside, for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of peace. The road ahead would be difficult, but Jake was determined to make sure Emma didn't have to walk it alone. The storm outside raged on, but in that moment, the garage was a place of safety, and that was all that mattered. The day had passed quietly in Jake's garage, the air heavy with the silence that often settled after a storm. Outside, the world was still shrouded in winter's grip, but inside, there was a sense of calm. Emma had settled into a routine of sorts, playing with some old toys Jake had found in a nearby shed and drawing pictures on scraps of paper she'd found around the garage. Jake was working on his bike, the clank of his tools echoing through the space, a sound that had always brought him peace. But today, there was a new weight in the air, a quiet tension he couldn't shake. It wasn't just the lingering chill of the storm outside. It was the feeling that something was coming. The sudden vibration of his phone on the workbench startled him. He wiped his hands on a rag, grabbed the phone, and checked the screen. It was an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat. He had learned a long time ago to be wary of unknown calls. With a deep breath, he answered. "Hello." The voice on the other end was low, almost garbled with static, but unmistakably familiar. "Jake, you know who this is," the voice said. It was Steele, the president of Jake's old chapter of the Hells Angels. Jake's heart sank. He hadn't heard from Steele in months, not since he'd left the club. "What do you want, Steele?" Jake's voice was rough, the edge of annoyance creeping in. Steele's laugh was harsh. "I know you're out there, Jake. You think you can just run away and hide. You know that doesn't work, right? Jake clenched his jaw, his knuckles white around the phone. He had left the club to escape the violence, to find peace, but he knew deep down that leaving didn't mean they would leave him alone. I'm not part of that life anymore, Jake said, his voice steady but firm. That's your problem now, not mine. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I'm calling because I know you've got something we need, Jake. And I'm not going to ask nicely. Jake's stomach churned. He knew exactly what Steele was referring to. He had left the club with more than just his bike and personal belongings. He had taken something else, something that would tie him forever to the Hells Angels, no matter how far he tried to run. I don't have it anymore, Jake lied. You know better than that, Steele replied. We both know you're lying. You're not as far gone as you think, Jake. And I'll be coming for what's mine. The line went dead. Jake stood there for a moment, staring at the phone, his heart racing. His mind flashed to Emma, who was sitting in the corner, quietly drawing. He couldn't let her get caught up in this. He had promised to protect her, and that meant taking care of the problems he had left behind. But Jake knew this was more than just about him. The Hells Angels didn't forget, and they didn't forgive. Jake turned to face Emma, who had stopped drawing and was looking at him with wide eyes. She must have seen the change in his expression, the tension in his posture. What's wrong? She asked, her voice small. Jake forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Nothing. Just some old business I need to take care of. Emma didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press. Instead, she stood up and walked over to him, her tiny hand clutching the drawing she had been working on. I made this for you, she said, holding up the picture. It was a crude drawing of a motorcycle with a big red heart in the middle. Jake took it from her, his heart tightening in his chest. Thank you, Emma, he said softly, kneeling down to her level. It's beautiful. She smiled her, eyes lighting up for a moment. But Jake could see the worry still lurking behind her expression. He had promised her safety, and now he was faced with a situation he couldn't ignore. His past was closing in on him. Steele's words echoed in his mind, and Jake knew what he had to do. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. He had to face the people he had tried to leave behind. Listen, Emma, Jake said, his voice low but firm. I need to take care of something. It's going to be okay, but I need you to stay here. I'll be back before you know it. She nodded, though Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He wasn't sure if he could protect her from what was coming, but he would try. He had to. As Jake grabbed his jacket and stepped out into the cold, the weight of his past felt heavier than ever. The wind cut through him, but it wasn't the cold that chilled him. It was the realization that he couldn't outrun his past. Not anymore. The Hells Angels were coming. And whether he was ready or not, Jake knew he had to face them. For Emma's sake, and for his own. Jake stood in front of the garage door, the harsh wind cutting through his jacket as he looked out into the snow-covered world. The air was heavy with tension, and the weight of the call from Steele still hung in his chest. He had always known the Hells Angels would come for him, but hearing Steele's voice again felt like a reminder that running away wasn't an option. He glanced over his shoulder, making sure Emma was still inside, safe and unaware of the storm that was coming. Her trust in him weighed on him more than any threat from the past. He couldn't afford to let her down. As Jake stepped out into the street, the roar of his bike's engine filled the air, a constant reminder of the life he had left behind. He had ridden through hell and back, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The night was quiet, almost eerily so, with only the distant sound of wind and the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots. He was heading toward the old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place he hadn't visited in years. It was where the Hells Angels would meet, and it was the last place he wanted to go. But he had no choice. Steele had made that clear. As Jake neared the building, the familiar sound of bikes revving in the distance told him he wasn't alone. He could feel his heart rate increase, the old instincts kicking in as he approached the gates. He had spent years trying to escape this world, but now, it was pulling him back in. The sound of boots on gravel reached his ears, and Jake turned to see several members of the Hells Angels approaching. They were dressed in their signature leather jackets, their faces hardened with the cold and years of loyalty to the club. Steele was at the front, his broad shoulders outlined by the streetlight behind him. Jake, Steele called out, his voice carrying a mix of authority and anger. You've got something that belongs to the club. You can't just walk away, not like this. Jake didn't respond at first. He stood his ground, staring at Steele, waiting for him to make the first move. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the past hanging over them both. "I'm not going back," Jake said finally, his voice firm. "I've left all that behind. I've got a new life now. And I'm not giving up what I've built. Not for you. Not for anyone." Steele stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he regarded Jake. "You think you can just walk away from us? From the Brotherhood? From everything we've been through?" Jake didn't flinch. "I'm not walking away. I'm moving on." Steele's eyes flicked behind Jake, noticing the garage. "Is that it?" Steele scoffed. "You think this place is going to protect you? You think a little girl is going to save you from what's coming? You're nothing without us, Jake. Don't you forget that." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut, but he didn't let them show. "You don't get it," Jake said, his voice low. "This is what I've been fighting for. This little girl," he nodded toward the garage. "She's my reason for doing things differently. I'm not going back to that life. Not for you. Not for anyone." Steele's expression softened for a brief moment, but then he shook his head, his face hardening again. "You've got a lot to learn, Jake. We don't just walk away from the club. You can't outrun your past." Jake took a step forward, meeting Steele's gaze. "I'm not outrunning anything," he said, his voice steady. "I'm facing it. And I'm not doing it with you." Steele didn't move, and for a moment, there was silence between them, the only sound the wind rustling through the empty streets. Jake could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had made his choice. He wasn't going back. And he wasn't going to let anything, anyone, drag him back into that world. "You don't have to do this, Jake," Steele said quietly, his voice almost pleading. "You could come back. We could fix things." Jake shook his head. "It's too late for that. I've made my peace." The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, the years of brotherhood, loyalty, and betrayal hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Finally, Steele turned and waved his hand, signaling the others to back off. "You're on your own now, Jake. But don't think for a second that we'll forget about you." Jake watched as Steele and the others walked back to their bikes, the sound of their engines roaring to life as they disappeared into the night. Jake stood there for a moment longer, his mind racing. He had made the right choice. He had to, but as the night air settled around him, he couldn't help but wonder what was next. The Hell's Angels were out there, and no matter how far he ran, he knew they wouldn't let him go that easily. He turned and walked back toward the garage, where Emma was waiting, unaware of the danger that still lingered in the shadows. As he entered, Emma looked up, her face lighting up when she saw him. She didn't know what had just happened, but she could tell something had changed. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice small but full of concern. Jake smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It will be," he said softly, his voice steady. "Everything's going to be just fine." But deep down, Jake knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The Hell's Angels had marked him, and they wouldn't forget. But for Emma, for the life he was building, he would keep fighting. The storm outside had passed, but the real battle was just beginning. Jake sat on the worn-out couch in his garage, his head leaning back against the wall as he stared at the ceiling. The events of the past few days had unfolded faster than he could process, each one adding weight to his already heavy heart. The confrontation with Steele, the brief moment when he had considered going back, now seemed like a lifetime ago. But the silence in the garage now, the stillness that came after the storm, didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. He glanced over at Emma, who was sitting on the floor, carefully going through the stack of old magazines Jake had left on the workbench. She was calm, her young face focused on the pictures, but Jake could tell something was weighing on her too. The worry in her eyes was impossible to hide. She had been through so much already, and now, here she was, far from her home, with no idea of what was truly happening around her. He knew he couldn't keep her in the dark forever, but the last thing he wanted was to burden her with his problems. He needed to keep her safe. That was the priority. The sound of the garage door creaking open interrupted his thoughts. Jake stood up immediately, his instincts on high alert. He had become accustomed to danger, always expecting it to show up uninvited. But this was different. It wasn't the usual late-night call or the sound of a knock on his door. This felt more like an impending storm. The door opened fully, and there stood a figure Jake hadn't seen in years. Murphy, the old mechanic who had taken Jake in all those years ago when the world had seemed like it was closing in. Murphy was a man of few words, but when he spoke, you listened. His presence in the doorway was both a comfort and a warning. "I need to talk to you, Jake," Murphy said, his voice gravelly but calm. Jake didn't hesitate. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes scanning the older man for any signs of urgency. Murphy stepped inside, his boots heavy against the concrete floor as he closed the door behind him. He glanced at Emma briefly, but then his focus returned to Jake. "You're in danger, kid," Murphy said, his words sharp and serious. "And it's not just from the Hell's Angels. You've got bigger problems." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He knew this was coming. He had known the moment Steele made that call. But hearing it from Murphy made it all feel real. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Murphy motioned for Jake to sit. "There's a lot of bad blood in your past, and I know you're trying to outrun it. But some things, Jake, you can't outrun." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "The Hell's Angels? They're just the beginning. There's a bigger game being played here, and it involves people with more power than you can imagine. And they've got their sights on you." Jake stood up abruptly, a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. "Who?" he demanded. Murphy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the workbench, pulling a piece of paper from his jacket pocket and laying it down in front of Jake. The paper was old, creased from age, but the ink was still legible. It was a map, one that Jake recognized immediately. It was a map of the town, but there were areas marked in red that he hadn't seen before. Murphy tapped a spot on the map with his finger. "This is where it all started. Right here, in your past. And these marks? They represent people you thought you could leave behind. But they're still watching, Jake. They're still waiting." Jake felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had known, deep down, that the past wasn't going to let him go. But this was worse than he had imagined. These people, whoever they were, weren't just looking for him. They were looking for something he didn't even know he had. "What do they want from me?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Murphy's eyes softened, but there was no sympathy in them. "They want you to come back. They want you to be the man you were before. But you're not that man anymore, Jake. And they know it. So now, they want to destroy everything you've built." The words hit Jake like a freight train. He had fought so hard to escape his past, to build something real, something good. But now, it felt like it was all slipping away. Murphy stood up straight, his face hardening. "You have to leave. Now. You have to get out of here, take Emma, and get as far away as you can. They'll be coming for you. They won't stop until they get what they want." Jake looked over at Emma, who was still sitting on the floor, her small face tilted up toward him with an unreadable expression. He couldn't let her get caught in this. She deserved better than all of this. "I'm not running," Jake said firmly. "I'm not running from them anymore." Murphy's face softened, and for the first time, Jake saw the concern in his eyes. "I'm not asking you to run, Jake. I'm telling you that if you don't leave now, it's not just your past that's going to catch up with you. It's Emma's too." Jake's heart sank. He had promised to protect her, to keep her safe. But how could he do that when he didn't even know how to protect himself? "I don't know what to do," Jake whispered. "What do I do?" Murphy placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, his grip firm. "You do what you've always done, kid. You fight. But this time, you fight smart. And you fight for her." Jake nodded, the weight of the world settling heavily on his shoulders. The storm outside might have passed, but the one brewing in his life was just beginning. And this time, there was no running from it. Jake felt the weight of Murphy's words like a heavy stone lodged in his chest, his mind racing with everything that had been said. The garage had gone silent again, save for the soft ticking of the bike's cooling engine. Emma was still in the corner, quietly playing, oblivious to the storm that was gathering outside the walls of the garage and within Jake's mind. He knew what he had to do. The danger was no longer a distant threat. It was here, breathing down his neck, and it wasn't just him it was coming for anymore. It was her too. Emma's safety had to be his first priority. She had already been through enough. Jake rubbed a hand over his face, trying to shake off the heaviness settling in his bones. There was no more room for indecision. The Hell's Angels wouldn't let him go, and if he was going to keep his promise to Emma, he had to act fast. He had to make a plan, and that meant leaving the garage. Jake walked toward the back of the room, his boots heavy on the concrete floor, and grabbed the bag he had packed with a few essential items, a change of clothes, money, his phone, and a few tools. The old mechanic instincts kicked in, even though this wasn't a repair job. This was survival. "We're leaving, Emma," Jake said, his voice low, trying to keep the panic from creeping in. Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide. She had noticed the change in him, the urgency that wasn't there before. "Leaving?" she asked, confusion written across her face. "Where are we going?" Jake hesitated. He didn't want to lie to her, but he couldn't tell her the full truth. "Not yet. We're just going somewhere safe for a little while," he said, forcing a smile. "I'll explain everything later." Emma stared at him for a long moment, and for a second, Jake thought she might protest, ask more questions, but instead, she stood up quietly, nodding as if she trusted him completely. "Okay, Jake," she said softly, grabbing her jacket and following him to the door. Jake opened the garage door just enough to slip out unnoticed. The snow had started to fall harder, blanketing the streets in a thick layer of white. The air was bitterly cold, and Jake could feel it cutting through his jacket as he looked down at Emma, who was clutching her teddy bear tightly in her arms. He hated this. He hated that she had to live through this, that she had to run from the world she should be enjoying. But he couldn't change the past. All he could do was protect her from what was coming. "Stay close," he murmured, pulling his coat tighter around him. "Don't let anyone see us." They moved quickly, staying in the shadows, keeping to the side streets where the streetlights barely reached. Jake could hear the sound of his boots crunching in the snow, but his focus was entirely on Emma, on getting her to safety. They reached the alley behind the diner, the one place Jake knew would be quiet enough to figure out their next move. He pulled her inside and looked around, making sure no one was following them. "We need to get to the old farmhouse," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. "It's off the grid, no one knows about it, and we'll be safe there for a while." Emma nodded, her face pale but resolute. She trusted him. "I'm scared, Jake," she whispered. Jake knelt down in front of her, cupping her small face in his hands. "I know, Emma. I'm scared too. But we're going to get through this, okay? You're not alone." He gave her a reassuring smile, though he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. The path ahead was uncertain, and he had no idea how long they could stay hidden. But for now, the farmhouse would have to do. They would make their way there tonight, find shelter, and figure out what their next move was. Jake turned and began walking again, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of danger. Emma stayed right beside him, her hand wrapped tightly around his. As they neared the edge of town, Jake's thoughts kept drifting back to the phone call with Steele. He had to get out of this, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Steele wasn't the type to let go once he had his sights set on something. And if Jake didn't act fast, they would both be in danger. His mind was a blur of plans, but as he glanced over at Emma, walking so bravely beside him, he knew that no matter what, he had to protect her. She was the only thing that mattered now. The sound of a motorcycle revving in the distance broke Jake's concentration. His head snapped up, eyes scanning the area. The sound was unmistakable. There were Hell's Angels nearby. The feeling of being hunted settled in his stomach, cold and unyielding. "Come on," he said quickly, pulling Emma into a nearby alley. They ducked behind a stack of crates, the sound of the bikes growing louder. Jake's heart raced as he pressed Emma against the wall, holding his breath. They couldn't be seen. Not now. Not when they were so close. He waited for what felt like an eternity, the sound of the motorcycles passing by just a few feet from where they were hidden. Finally, the sound faded. Jake exhaled slowly, his pulse still racing. That was too close, he muttered under his breath. Emma looked up at him, her face pale but calm. "Are we okay now?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Jake nodded, giving her another smile, this time a little more genuine. "We're okay," he said, though deep down, he wasn't sure how much longer they could stay that way. But he wasn't about to let her know that. Not yet. They had made it this far, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe, no matter what came next. The farmhouse was still a few miles away, hidden on the outskirts of town, nestled between the dense woods and fields that stretched for miles. The road had become narrower, rougher, and less traveled. The wind had picked up, biting through the layers of Jake's jacket as he glanced at Emma, who was walking quietly beside him. The tension from earlier still hung in the air, but they were managing to stay hidden for now. The motorcycles from before hadn't come back, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed their absence. The clock was ticking. Emma was quiet, her small hand clutching his tightly. Her eyes flickered up at him now and then, as if checking that he was still there, still leading them towards safety. It wasn't just the physical danger they faced. It was the weight of the uncertainty that pressed down on them both. Jake had promised Emma safety, but that promise felt fragile, like a thread that might snap at any moment. They reached the edge of the forest, where the trees began to grow thick, their bare branches swaying in the wind. Ahead of them was a small, rundown house, just a building, really. It wasn't much, but it had served Jake well in the past. It had been a refuge when he had nowhere else to go. Now, it would serve the same purpose. He led Emma up the narrow path to the door, his boots crunching on the frosty ground. The farmhouse wasn't much, but it was isolated, and that made it the perfect place to lie low. The door creaked open as Jake turned the rusty knob, the smell of old wood and dust greeting them. It was cold inside, the fireplace long extinguished, but it was a shelter. Jake led Emma inside, carefully locking the door behind them. The house was sparsely furnished, with a few old chairs, a worn-out couch, and a rickety table in the center of the room. The only warmth came from a small heater in the corner, barely making a dent in the chill. Jake set down his bag and moved to the window, peeking through the drawn curtains. The snow had begun to fall harder, the storm outside growing more intense. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't safe yet. The farmhouse was a temporary solution, but it wouldn't keep them hidden forever. The only thing Jake could do was wait, and hope the storm would keep anyone from coming out looking for them. Emma sat down on the couch, her small body curled up in a ball, clutching the teddy bear she had brought with her. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jake could see it in her eyes. She was scared, but she was also strong. "I'll start a fire," Jake muttered, walking over to the pile of wood in the corner. As he bent down to gather the logs, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him again. He wasn't sure how long they could stay here, how long they could keep running. The Hells Angels weren't the only threat they faced. There were others out there, people who would do anything to get what they wanted. And Jake didn't know if he could protect Emma from them. As he worked to start the fire, his thoughts kept drifting back to Steele's words. The Hells Angels would never stop coming for him, not as long as he carried their mark. And no matter how far he ran, no matter how many new lives he tried to build, they would always find him. And Emma would always be in danger because of him. He shoved the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. He had to stay focused. He couldn't let fear cloud his judgment, not now. The fire crackled to life, filling the room with warmth. Jake sat down next to Emma, his gaze softening as he looked at her. She was asleep now, her face pressed against the armrest of the couch, the teddy bear still clutched tightly in her arms. For a moment, everything felt still, quiet, as if they had found a small slice of peace in a chaotic world. But Jake knew this peace wouldn't last. The past had a way of catching up to you, no matter how hard. You tried to outrun it, and sooner or later, the Hells Angels would come. Jake stood up, walking over to the small window and looking out into the snow. The storm had picked up again, the wind howling through the trees. He couldn't see far, but the feeling in his gut told him that the calm wouldn't last. The Hells Angels would be coming. The question was when. He turned back to look at Emma, her small form curled up on the couch. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. He couldn't let anything happen to her. He walked over to the door and checked the lock again, ensuring it was secure. The farmhouse was isolated, but that didn't mean they were safe. He needed to be ready. Jake walked back to the fire and sat down, his eyes fixed on the flames. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't running anymore. Not from the Hells Angels, and not from his past. He was going to face it head-on, whatever it took. And Emma would be with him every step of the way. He had to believe that. He had to protect her. For her, he would fight. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling through the trees, pushing the snow into swirling, angry patterns. Inside the farmhouse, Jake sat by the fire, his mind racing with thoughts of what was coming. The warmth of the flames was a temporary comfort, but it did little to soothe the gnawing tension in his gut. The Hells Angels were closing in. Jake knew it was just a matter of time before they tracked him down, and he had to be ready. His eyes shifted to Emma, who was curled up on the couch, her teddy bear still clutched tightly in her arms. She was sound asleep, but Jake knew she could sense the change in the air. Kids always knew when something wasn't right, even if they didn't understand it. He couldn't let her live in fear, not when he had promised her safety. He had to keep fighting, for her. The clock was ticking. The small farmhouse wasn't the fortress it had seemed when he first arrived. It was vulnerable, isolated, and if the Hell's Angels found it, there would be no escape. He needed to figure out a way to move her again, to get them both far away from the danger that was closing in. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air as Jake stood up and paced. His mind was spinning, but there was no clear solution. The past kept haunting him, the memories of the club, of his time as an enforcer, never far from his thoughts. He couldn't outrun it. He could only try to outsmart it. He went to the window again, peering through the curtains. The wind had picked up, and the world outside was nearly impossible to see, but Jake's instincts told him someone was out there. A figure in the distance, moving quietly through the storm. His heart skipped a beat. Damn, Jake muttered under his breath. Someone was here. He knew it wasn't a coincidence. They had found him. Jake's hand instinctively went to the gun hidden beneath his jacket. It wasn't much, but it was enough for self-defense. He couldn't risk being caught off guard. He turned toward Emma, who was still sleeping soundly, unaware of the tension in the air. His heart ached as he looked at her, her small face peaceful despite the chaos around them. He couldn't let anything happen to her. Not now. Not ever. He turned back to the window, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. The figure was getting closer. He couldn't tell who it was, but he wasn't taking any chances. He grabbed his jacket and moved to the door, his mind focused on the threat outside. Emma stirred on the couch, the soft sound of her shifting breaking the silence. Jake froze for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to wake her, not yet. But he couldn't leave her unprotected either. He quickly turned back to her, checking the door one last time before quietly locking it behind him. Stay here, he whispered softly, though he knew Emma wouldn't understand the danger. Stay safe. He stepped out into the cold, pulling the collar of his jacket tight around his neck. The wind cut through him like a knife, but he forced himself to focus. He had to find out who it was before they found him. He moved cautiously through the snow, careful to make no sound as he approached the edge of the yard. The figure in the distance was almost there. He could see the outline now, someone tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat. His heart skipped again. Was it one of the Hell's Angels? Or was it someone else, someone connected to his past? Jake took a deep breath and ducked behind a stack of old crates, trying to stay out of sight. He couldn't risk being seen too soon. The figure stopped near the edge of the property, standing still as if they were waiting for something. Jake's grip on the gun tightened. He couldn't tell if they had seen him, but he wasn't about to wait and find out. He moved quickly, staying low to the ground, until he was just a few feet behind the figure. The wind howled around him, muffling the sound of his footsteps, but the figure still hadn't noticed him. Jake raised his gun, ready for whatever came next. But then the figure turned around. Jake, the voice said, low and steady. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but there was something familiar about it. Jake's heart stopped for a moment as he lowered the gun, his eyes narrowing. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a weathered face and eyes that held too many secrets. You've been a hard man to find, the stranger said, his voice gravelly but calm. Jake didn't speak immediately, his mind racing to place the man. Who was he? Why had he come here? Who the hell are you? Jake finally asked, his voice low, his body tense with readiness. The man smiled faintly. I'm not here for trouble. I'm here to warn you. The words hit Jake like a punch. Warning him? Of what? The man took a step forward, glancing briefly at the farmhouse in the distance. You've made a lot of enemies, Jake. And the Hell's Angels aren't your only problem. There are others looking for you, and they won't stop until they find you. Jake's stomach twisted as he listened. Who are you working for? He demanded. The man shook his head. I'm not working for anyone. But you've got a bigger mess on your hands than you realize. The Hell's Angels? They're just the beginning. Jake's mind raced. What the hell was going on? Why should I trust you? He asked, his grip tightening on the gun. The man's eyes softened. Because I'm not your enemy. But if you don't listen, you're going to drag her into this too. Jake's heart skipped at the mention of Emma. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't risk Emma getting caught in whatever mess was coming next. What do you want? Jake asked, his voice colder now. I want you to leave, the man said quietly. Before it's too late. Jake stood frozen in the cold night air, staring at the man who had just appeared on his property. His words echoed in Jake's mind, but they didn't make sense. Leave before it's too late. The warning hung there, like a dark cloud, heavy and unrelenting. Jake didn't know who this man was or what he wanted, but one thing was clear. He wasn't here to help. Who the hell are you? Jake asked again, his voice sharper this time. The man looked back at him, his face obscured by the shadows, but Jake could see the faint glint of understanding in his eyes. Doesn't matter who I am, the man replied. What matters is who you are, and what you've done. They're coming for you, Jake, and they'll destroy everything in their path to get to you. Jake's hand instinctively went to the gun tucked in his waistband, but he didn't draw it. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. What do you want from me? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice calm. The man stepped forward, his boots crunching in the snow as he lowered his voice. I want you to listen, because if you don't, it's not just you that's going to get hurt. It's her too. The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He didn't need to ask who her was. He already knew. Emma, the little girl who had already been through too much. The one he had promised to protect. He couldn't afford to let anything happen to her. What do you know about her? Jake demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The man looked at him with an expression that was both regretful and urgent. I know more than I should, he said, his eyes flickering toward the farmhouse in the distance. And I know that you've already made a target of her just by being here. The people you're running from? They don't just want you. They want her too. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the truth settling heavily on his shoulders. He had known the danger was closing in, but hearing it spoken out loud made it feel real in a way that scared him more than anything. He had tried to keep Emma safe, but now it seemed like he was failing her. Who are they? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes narrowed, as if weighing how much to reveal. They're not just the Hells Angels, Jake. They're a network. Powerful people who control everything from the shadows. And they've been keeping tabs on you for a long time. Jake clenched his fists, his mind racing with the implications. He had left the Hells Angels to escape their violence, but now it seemed like there was no escape from the people they had ties with. The club wasn't just a group of bikers anymore. It was a dangerous organization with connections that reached far beyond the streets. What do they want from me? Jake repeated, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. The man sighed, glancing toward the farmhouse one last time before speaking again. They want the records you took. The ones you thought you could hide. They know you've got them, Jake. And they're coming for them. They'll do whatever it takes to get them back. And if they have to use her to make you give them up, they will. The words felt like a slap, and Jake's stomach twisted in knots. He had no idea what the man was talking about. He had taken nothing from anyone. But if they thought he had something valuable, something they wanted, then they would stop at nothing to get it. And if Emma was in the middle of it, Jake didn't know how he could protect her. I don't have anything, Jake said, his voice rising with frustration. I don't even know what you're talking about. The man didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be studying Jake, looking for something in his expression. Finally, he spoke again. You've got something, Jake, and you don't even realize it. You've always been part of something bigger than you think. And now that they've found you, there's no turning back. You either run, or you fight. But if you run, you drag her into it too. The weight of the man's words hung in the air, and Jake's thoughts spun out of control. He didn't know who to trust anymore. The Hells Angels? This mysterious man? The people who were coming for him? It all felt like one big trap, and Emma was the bait. I can't leave her, Jake said firmly, his voice shaking slightly. She's not going through this. Not because of me. The man's expression softened, just for a moment, before he gave a small nod. Then you'll have to fight, he said simply. But if you fight, you need to be ready for everything. Because they won't stop. And neither will I. The man turned to leave, his footsteps crunching in the snow as he disappeared into the darkness. Jake stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. What was he supposed to do now? Fight? Run? The world around him had turned into a maze of danger and lies, and Emma was caught in the middle of it. He had no idea how to keep her safe, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone take her away from him. Not without a fight. Jake stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, his eyes scanning the snow-covered horizon, but all he could see was darkness. The storm had intensified, and the world outside had turned into a blur of white, making it difficult to see anything clearly. His mind, however, was as sharp as ever. The words the mysterious man had left him with were echoing in his head. Fight or run. But if you fight, you need to be ready for everything. Jake knew the danger was closing in, but the uncertainty of how to protect Emma was the hardest part. He had promised her safety, and the idea that he might fail her tore at him. As much as he wanted to turn back the clock, he couldn't. They were in this together now, and running away was no longer an option. His hand reached for his gun, still tucked inside his jacket, the weight of it reassuring, even if it was a temporary comfort. He had been in plenty of situations where a gun had been his only way out, but this time, it felt different. This time, the fight was for Emma. He turned back to the farmhouse and moved to the small table where Emma was sitting, quietly drawing on a piece of paper. She had barely spoken since the man had left, her eyes constantly watching him, waiting for some sign that everything was going to be okay. Jake knelt beside her, forcing a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly. Emma looked up at him, her small face filled with concern. "What's wrong, Jake?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Jake sighed, sitting down beside her. "Nothing that we can't handle, kid. We just have to be smart about it, that's all." Emma studied him for a moment, and for the first time, Jake saw a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. She knew something was happening, something bigger than what she could grasp, but she wasn't afraid. She was stronger than most adults, her quiet resilience a testament to how much she had already endured. "What's going to happen to us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's heart tightened. He couldn't lie to her. He wasn't sure what was going to happen. He could only protect her for so long before the storm hit. "I don't know, Emma," he said, his voice soft. "But I promise you this. I won't let anything happen to you, no matter what." She nodded, her small hand reaching up to grip his. "I trust you, Jake," she said, her words simple but heavy. Jake's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. The weight of her trust in him felt like both a gift and a burden. He had to keep his promise. He had to keep her safe. There was no other option. As the hours passed, the storm outside raged on, the wind howling and the snow falling in thick sheets. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The Hell's Angels would be looking for him, and now, it seemed like the people he had tried to leave behind were closing in. But he couldn't run. Not anymore. The farmhouse was isolated, and that was both a blessing and a curse. It would keep them hidden for a while, but Jake knew it wouldn't be enough. He had to make a plan, and fast. He stood up, his mind racing. There was only one place where they might be safe, one place where the Hell's Angels and whoever else was after him wouldn't find them. It was risky, but it was the only chance they had. He turned to Emma, who had returned to her drawings. "Emma, listen to me," Jake said, kneeling down in front of her. She looked up, her eyes wide. "We have to go. There's a place I know, a cabin in the mountains. It's far away from here, and it's safe. We can stay there until things settle down." Emma blinked, taking in his words, but she didn't hesitate. "Are we going now?" she asked, her voice steady. Jake nodded, his heart swelling with pride. She was strong, stronger than he had given her credit for. "Yeah, we're leaving now. We need to move fast. Can you get your stuff?" Emma nodded again, standing up quickly and grabbing her small bag. She didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate. She trusted Jake, and that was enough for him. They moved quickly, gathering what little they needed for the journey ahead. Jake grabbed his gear and a few supplies, making sure they had everything they would need for the trip. It wasn't far to the cabin, but with the storm and the danger lurking, he wanted to be prepared for anything. As he looked around the farmhouse one last time, he knew it was time to go. The calm he had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a sharp sense of urgency. The past was catching up to them, and Jake wasn't going to wait around for it to swallow them whole. He grabbed Emma's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Stay close to me, all right?" he said. Emma nodded, and together, they stepped out into the storm, the wind howling around them as they made their way into the night. The road ahead was uncertain, the danger growing with every step, but Jake was ready. For her, for the promise he had made, and for whatever came next. The storm raged on as Jake and Emma trudged through the thick snow, the wind cutting through their clothes and the icy air biting at their skin. They had been walking for hours, the farmhouse now far behind them, and the cabin in the mountains still miles away. The world around them was a blur of white, the howling wind drowning out any sound but the crunch of their boots in the snow. Jake kept his head low, focusing on each step, his hand firmly gripping Emma's. She was shivering, her small body wrapped in a coat far too thin for the weather, but she didn't complain. She had been strong through everything, and Jake admired her for it. She was stronger than most grown men he knew. Almost there, kid, Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady, though the exhaustion was starting to wear on him. Emma nodded, her face pale, her eyes wide from the cold, but she didn't speak. Jake could tell she was trying to be brave for him, just like he was trying to be brave for her. Every step they took felt like an eternity. The cabin wasn't far now, but the snow was piling up fast, and the wind was making it harder to see anything in front of them. Jake's thoughts kept drifting back to the warning from the mysterious man, the people who were after him, after Emma. The Hells Angels, the network of people from his past, all of them closing in. He had thought that leaving the club would be his escape, but the truth was, there was no escaping your past. Jake's heart ached as he thought of the life he had left behind. He had fought for so long, run from his mistakes, but now they were all catching up to him. And Emma, innocent and vulnerable, was caught in the middle of it. He had promised her safety, but how could he protect her from something like this? The sound of Emma's soft voice broke through his thoughts. "Jake," she said quietly, her voice weak from the cold. "I'm scared." Jake looked down at her, his heart aching. He hadn't wanted to show her how scared he was, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel real. She was scared, and he didn't have the answers. "I know, kid," he said softly, kneeling down beside her and wiping the snow from her face. "I'm scared too, but we're gonna make it, okay? We just have to keep going. Just a little farther." Emma nodded, though her eyes were filled with uncertainty. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough to know they were in danger, and she trusted him to get her out of it. Jake stood up and adjusted the strap on his bag, pushing through the cold with everything he had left. They had to reach the cabin. He couldn't afford to stop, not now. The wind was stronger than ever, and the snow was falling so thick it was hard to see where they were going. But Jake kept his eyes focused on the horizon, knowing that the cabin would be their refuge. They just had to get there. After what felt like hours, Jake finally spotted the dark shape of the cabin in the distance. His heart raced with relief, but it was short-lived. The sound of engines in the distance reached his ears, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. His blood ran cold. It was them, the Hells Angels. They had found him. The engine roared louder, cutting through the howling wind, and Jake knew there was no more time to waste. They had to make it to the cabin, and fast. He grabbed Emma's hand and ran, pushing through the snow, his legs burning with the effort. The cabin was so close now, just a few more steps, but the sound of the bikes grew louder, and Jake knew they wouldn't be able to outrun them. He had no choice but to make a stand. They reached the cabin door just as the first bike screeched to a halt behind them. Jake threw the door open and pulled Emma inside, slamming it shut behind them. The sound of the wind was deafening outside, but inside, it was eerily quiet. They were safe, at least for now. Jake turned to Emma, his chest heaving from the run. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "Don't come out until I say so. Understand?" Emma nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Jake's heart ached as he saw the fear in her eyes, but he knew she had to stay hidden. He couldn't risk her getting caught in the middle of this. He walked to the window, peeking through the small crack in the wooden boards. The bikes were parked outside, their engines growling in the snow. Jake's blood ran cold as he saw the men approaching the cabin. The Hells Angels had found him, and they weren't here for a friendly chat. He could hear their voices now, muffled by the door, but the tone was unmistakable. They were looking for him. Jake's hand went to the gun at his side, but he didn't draw it yet. He had to wait. He had to make sure Emma was safe before he did anything. The men outside were getting closer, their boots crunching in the snow, and Jake's pulse quickened. He had no idea how long they would stay outside, but he knew they wouldn't leave until they had what they wanted. And if they didn't get it from him, they would take it from Emma. He had to stop them. But how? The door to the cabin rattled under the pounding fists of the men outside. Jake's hand tightened around the grip of his gun, the cold metal reassuring in his palm. He could hear their voices now, louder, more aggressive, each one a threat that brought the tension in his chest to a breaking point. "We know you're in there, Jake," a voice yelled, filled with authority. "Come out now, and we'll make this quick. You don't want this to get messy." Jake's pulse quickened as he crouched low to the ground. Emma was still huddled in the corner, her wide eyes reflecting the fear that had taken hold of both of them. She didn't deserve this. None of this was her fault. His mind raced with options, but none of them felt like they would keep her safe. The storm outside was still raging, the wind howling through the cracks of the old cabin. But Jake's world had shrunk to the small, cold space in front of him. He glanced at Emma, her face pale, her small hands tightly gripping her teddy bear as she clutched it to her chest. "Stay down, Emma," Jake whispered as he moved toward the window, his eyes scanning the scene outside. The men had spread out, circling the cabin like predators, looking for any way in. There was no escaping them now. This was it. This was the fight he had been running from for so long. But there was no more running. He couldn't run anymore, not while Emma was in danger. "Jake," the voice outside broke through his thoughts. "We're coming in. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Jake's mind snapped into action. He had one chance to get out of this. He had to make it count. He looked at the window, then at the door, weighing his options. There was no way out the front, not with the Hell's Angels outside. But if he could get to the back of the cabin, there might still be a chance. "Stay here," Jake said again, his voice firm but gentle as he turned to Emma. She didn't move, her eyes locked on his face, but she nodded. She trusted him. It was all he needed. Jake moved quickly, slipping through the back door, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold hit him immediately as he stepped outside, but there was no time to waste. He had to get to the tree line, cover his tracks, and somehow get Emma out of here. But as he moved toward the trees, the sound of footsteps behind him made him stop dead in his tracks. "Jake," a familiar voice called out. His body tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun. He turned to see Murphy standing there, his face set in a grim expression. "I told you they'd come," Murphy said quietly, his eyes scanning the area. "You don't have time to think this through, Jake. We have to go. Now." Jake hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. Murphy had been a part of his life once, a mentor of sorts. But was he here to help, or was he part of the reason the Hell's Angels had found him? "What are you doing here?" Jake asked, his voice low and wary. "I'm here to get you out of this," Murphy said, his voice steady. "I don't know how much time you've got, but we can't stay here. We can make it to the old road up north. It's off the grid. They won't find you there." Jake didn't have time to think. He didn't trust Murphy completely, but right now, he had no other choice. "Where's Emma?" Jake asked, suddenly panicked. Murphy pointed back to the cabin. "She's inside, hiding. They won't hurt her. But we need to move." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he turned back to the cabin. He couldn't leave without Emma. "We're not leaving without her," he said, his voice firm. Murphy nodded and followed him toward the cabin. "I won't let them hurt her, Jake," Murphy said, his voice low. "But we don't have much time. The others are closing in." The door to the cabin was still closed, but Jake could hear the men outside, their voices growing louder as they neared the entrance. He had to act fast. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his gun raised, scanning the room for any signs of danger. Emma was sitting on the floor, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with fear. Jake's heart skipped a beat when he saw her. She was safe, but she was scared, and that was enough to drive him forward. He moved quickly toward her, kneeling beside her. "We're leaving, Emma," Jake said, his voice soft but urgent. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Jake, what's happening? Why are they here?" Jake gently took her hand and helped her to her feet. "They're not going to hurt you, kid. I won't let them." Emma nodded, though her expression remained anxious. Jake turned back to Murphy, who was standing near the door, watching the scene unfold. "We need to go, Jake. They're almost here." Jake looked down at Emma, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. But he had made a promise, and he wasn't going to break it now. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. Together, they moved toward the back door, stepping out into the cold night air. Jake's breath clouded in front of him as he held Emma close, moving quickly through the snow, away from the danger and toward the safety Murphy had promised. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they made their way toward the road, but Jake knew the real battle had just begun. There was no going back, and there was no time to waste. The Hell's Angels would be looking for them, but Jake was done running. He was going to fight for Emma, and he wasn't going to stop until she was safe. "I've been through many challenges in my life, but nothing has been quite as intense as the events of these Hell Angel stories. As I watch my world spiral out of control, every decision seems like it could lead to a different outcome. The story takes you deep into a world where danger lurks behind every corner, where the past never stays buried for long, and where protecting the innocent is the only thing worth fighting for. As the storm rages outside, I struggle to keep Emma safe from the men who have come looking for me, their engines roaring as they approach. In these Hell Angel stories, you'll find the complexity of loyalty, betrayal, and the cost of choosing the right path. I never thought I'd be caught in the middle of such a dangerous web, but here I am, facing the consequences of my actions. This isn't just a battle for survival. It's a fight for redemption and for the future of the one person I vowed to protect. As the Hell's Angels close in, the choice becomes clear: fight or run. But in these Hell Angels stories, there's more to it than just escaping. It's about making sure the past doesn't destroy everything you've worked for. Join me as I navigate the chaos, hoping against hope that I can shield Emma from the dangerous world I've left behind. Every step is a step toward either freedom or ruin, and I'm determined to ensure it's not the latter. As we make our way into the unknown, I realize that the price of peace is higher than I ever imagined. But with Emma by my side, maybe we can finally escape the nightmare that has been chasing us. These Hell Angels stories continue to unfold, and each moment feels like it could change everything. Let's see how far I'll go to protect the one person who matters the most in my life.